Most of you know that during my childhood, I reached the decision that I was going to be a Florida State Trooper. I've talked to you about that before. When a law enforcement class was actually offered in high school, taught by a deputy sheriff, I just jumped all over that class. I loved it. It was my favorite class. I couldn't wait for the tests because whether we were talking about misdemeanors or felonies, it didn't matter. I just aced everything. It was just absolutely a joy to be in that class. So everything was pointing that direction until one individual mentioned to me about thinking about going to Bible college, and all my inner thoughts were like, there's no way. My course is set, and I just continue to push forward. Then my youth minister added his voice to the encouragement and asked me if I had ever written out the advantages and the disadvantages on a piece of paper to go to the police academy as well as to go to Bible college. And of course, I had never done that. So I accepted the challenge. And for the next 2 weeks, I spent time writing out the advantages and the disadvantages of both going to Bible college as well as going into the police academy. And so after the 2 weeks was over, I was scheduled to go back and talk with the youth minister. But as I'm looking at my list, sure enough, my list pointed me straight into one of those black and yellow trooper cars. And it was without a doubt, that's what I was going to do. And so I went to my youth minister's office with full confidence that my list provided proof positive and a direction to a purpose to my life to write speeding tickets and work traffic accidents and help people on the highway. Well, when I arrived in his office, he was busy doing something else, and so he told me just to grab a seat and kind of wait for him to get done, and then we'd talk. And so as I sat there, I was looking at my list, and that's when it hit me. Actually, that's when he hit me, not my youth minister, but the Holy Spirit, as if scales had fallen off my eyes. I was able to view my list. It just became spiritually clear, crystal clear. One side was very selfish, and one side was very selfless. And although I never heard God's audible voice, it was as clear as if I had. I announced to my youth minister, I said, I'm going to Bible college. And he responded with, well, we haven't even talked about it yet. I'm like, we don't have to. God just called me into the ministry. It was absolutely amazing thing. I don't remember the day of the week or the day of the year it was, but I remember exactly where I was in the room. I remember the chair I was in. I remember the direction I was facing. God called me into the ministry. It was not my call. It was not man's call. And I started Bible college at the age of 17. During my junior year of Bible college, 1986, 1987 is when I started into weekend youth ministry. When I graduated in 88, I went full-time. 12 years later, in December of 1999, I shifted into preaching ministry where I've been since. And I still have that advantage and disadvantage list. It was written in pencil. I still have it, and every once in a while, I pull it out, and it reminds me of a time and a day when God called me into selfless action for His kingdom. Where does service, where does sacrifice rate among your personal priorities? Do you regularly sacrifice for God and others, or do you tend to live your life self-absorbed? When the church has a work day, we may have one once a year, do you immediately go up and sign up? Are you happy when you're called upon to sacrifice? Sacrifice rarely, if ever, is convenient. That's one of the reasons why it's called sacrifice. Yet the more a person makes sacrifice and service a part of their everyday life, the less they really think about it as a sacrifice. Now, kids, when your parents ask you to clean your room, when they ask you to help feed the dog or take care of your brother or your sister or take out the trash, are there eye rolls and, or do you jump for joy at the opportunity to help out around the house? How does mom and dad sacrifice for you? How does grandma and grandpa sacrifice? With their time. Maybe they have set their own schedule aside to go to your recital or to go to your game. In talking with Phyllis is getting ready to travel to North Carolina to see, her grandson play football on a Friday night. And that speaks volumes about the sacrifices that we make for family. Sometimes as parents, moms and dads are making sacrifices of money as we get back to school. I mean, the summer's almost over. I know that's bad news, but we have to go and get school supplies. And so there's more expense involved in that now as we get pencils and clothes and shoes and backpacks. All those are sacrifices. And as we age as children, adult children, they sacrifice their location and their retirement plans and their choices for their aging parents. Spouses sacrifice their preferences and their dreams and their comfort for the other. Our country's military members, they sacrifice their family time and their security and sometimes their own lives for all of us. Church members, you sacrifice for the leadership by being open to change and giving the benefit of the doubt when one is necessary, and sacrificing your finances by being a good steward and giving to the church. Staff members and leaders, they sacrifice for church members by avoiding excessive spending and getting the church in a bad situation or not overreacting to unfair criticism. Not that unfair criticism would ever happen in a church. Employers sacrifice for their employees by offering unearned paid leave for an emergency that comes up. Employees sacrifice for their boss by staying late and completing the job right with excellence the first time. Teachers sacrifice for their students by paying out of their own pocket for student supplies year after year. All these sacrifices, all this service has intimacy implications. Jesus informed his disciples that the standard operating procedures in his kingdom were a lot different than the rest of the world. And he not only profoundly spoke about the differences, he personally demonstrated it with his life and death and his resurrection so that we could be ransomed from our shame and our sin. The depth and the distance of his sacrifice is absolutely incredible of what he did for us, and it sets a blueprint for us to follow. In talking with his disciples, this is what the conversation, how it went in Matthew 20. But Jesus called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, despite the fact that all sacrifice, all service has the potential to improve intimacy with God and others, there's so many avenues that we could travel. We're going to limit that to 4 this morning. We're going to talk about 4 facets of sacrifice that will help us detangle ourselves from being self-absorbed. Because self-absorption leads us away from intimacy, and sacrifice and service leads us towards intimacy. First, to move toward intimacy with God and others, we've got to sacrifice our personal pride. Going back several decades, in 1961, Arnold Palmer had already won 2 Masters golf championships. And he was on the verge of his 3rd. And leading by a stroke, he hit an absolutely amazing shot that all but assured victory. Well, walking up to his ball, he passed a friend who reached out his hand. And while shaking Palmer's hand, the friend actually congratulated Palmer on the victory. Well, Palmer's next shot landed in the sand. Then he missed his putt and he lost the tournament. Now, later on in his career, Palmer was asked about this event, and he said, quote, "As soon as I shook his hand, I knew I had lost my focus," unquote. Pride can do that. Pride moves us to lose our focus, but pride does more than that. Pride fuels a very unrealistic outlook about ourselves. It causes us to overestimate our own capacity to celebrate ourselves rather than celebrate God. Pride moves us actually towards isolation as well. It causes disengagement from community. We disengage when we're proud. It makes us disengage from our relationships. We get so caught up gazing inside the mirror, we forget to glance outside the window. Pride also nurtures a critical spirit as well. It causes us to zero in on discouraging negatives rather than encouraging positives. We become quick to point out everybody else's flaw at the neglect of seeing our own. So pride is an elusive enemy with multiple tentacles, and it's got to be sacrificed on the altar of humility. Author C.S. Lewis wrote this, quote, "True humility is not thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less," unquote. Very wise statement. Humility actually redirects our outlook from ourselves onto God and others. And if we want to move toward intimacy with God and others, we've got to sacrifice our personal pride. Second, to move toward intimacy with God and others, we've got to sacrifice our possession obsession. Daryl Hall and John Oates in 1984 wrote a song entitled Possession Obsession, and here's a few of the lyrics. "You know there's something you need right here and now to fill the space inside of yourself. Money, love, or power. When you want to have the number one first run anyone, you're crazy till you own them. You ought to know better than that. The more that you buy, the less that you get back. It's a case of possession obsession. Gimme, gimme." Our fleshly addiction for more has actually constructed barriers and impediments for desiring Jesus, for desiring the Savior. Now, we live in a very consumer-driven, material-obsessed world that spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and that's just in North America, to convince us that our needs can be met with their alternative. Their central message is that we're less without whatever it is that they're peddling. If we want to be more, we have to purchase the right shampoo, get the right haircut, buy the right house, the lingerie, the money, the vacation package, whatever it is. And we're so inundated by this, we hardly notice until we do, and we run out and make a purchase or we place an order on Amazon. Now, Susie and I discovered years ago that for us, simple with less is actually a better way to live. Now, obviously, we still buy things, but more often than not, when we get ready to make a purchase, it is specifically for the purpose of how it's going to simplify our life, isn't it? I mean, we just talked about it yesterday. We bought a new door handle on the front door that's got a little code, because when you're carrying 2 kids, grandkids, 4 backpacks, you cannot reach into your pocket to grab your keys, but you can punch 4 numbers to open up the door. That was a purchase that simplified life. And so that's what we're looking at. But when you buy more stuff, there's more breakdowns, there's more repairs, there's more replacements, there's more headaches. And so when we decided to live a simple lifestyle, when you decide to live a simpler lifestyle, it allows us to fight possession obsession. It allows us to enjoy our relationships more fully, because the Savior is definitely more satisfying than stuff. Amen? Not only should we sacrifice our personal pride and our possession obsession, but if we're going to have a move toward intimacy with God and others, we've got to sacrifice our dependence on positional leadership. Now, this can be difficult for those in our culture to understand, but great leaders know with the sacrifice of freedoms, with the sacrifice of rights, with the sacrifice of privileges actually comes the increase of influence, and it's a great trade. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this concept of positional leadership, which is the lowest form of leadership there are 2 phrases that perfectly capture this form of leadership. One, a boss would say, "Do it because I'm the boss." And second phrase is, "Do it because I said so." Now, how many of us as parents, or maybe our parents said that, we've relied on that from time to time, because especially when a kid keeps asking us why, and chases down 7 times, we get frustrated and we finally just say, "Do it because I said so." That's positional leadership. Now, in America, we're always fighting for our rights. We see it on TV every day in the news. We read about it on Yahoo News or Fox News. We read about someone fighting for their rights. And we think that when we arrive at a certain station in life, we actually become entitled. But that's not how it works in the kingdom of Christ. When we arrive in the kingdom of Jesus, we should notice that we're more a servant now than when we first began the journey. There's no ladder to climb. There's no people to crawl over. There's just service to render and people to love. That's the kingdom of Jesus. And when we willingly limit our freedoms as Christians, when we set aside our rights, when we pursue the best interests of those God has called us to serve, that's when we're actually biblically walking in the footsteps of Jesus. So we need to sacrifice our personal pride, our possession obsession, and our positional leadership. But fourth, to move toward intimacy with God and others, we've got to sacrifice performance-based righteousness. Years ago, I realized I had a false sense of depending on my own righteousness. Now, righteousness means right living. And none of us, like I said last week, none of us are any good at it. Okay? But even after being a Christian for decades, my perspective on my Christian life was tied up in things like, I have to do this, I can't do that, I need to avoid this, I have to complete this activity every single day to be a good Christian, I need to make sure that I walk the straight and narrow over here, and I need to walk the straight and narrow over there. And as you notice, that faulty sense of my own righteousness was wrapped up in I statements. And I came to the realization that I wasn't getting it done. I hadn't been getting it done. But Jesus actually had already gotten it done. And so I recognized that I was in this endless trap, this loop of despair, never measuring up, always failing. So what did I do? I spent time thinking about the last 3 words Jesus said on the cross of Calvary. He said, "It is finished." I spent days thinking about that phrase. It is finished. And by the time I was done, I was actually set free with a whole new spiritual frame of reference. Why was I living as if my righteousness was needed to provide my salvation? Now understand this. I am not suggesting I don't need to follow Jesus. I am not suggesting you don't need to follow Jesus, because we do. What I'm saying is more than just the spiritual awareness that it wasn't my righteousness providing entrance into heaven. Does that mean that I have permission to become a bigger and better sinner than I already am? Of course not. It just means I choose to acknowledge it's about what Jesus did for me rather than what I can do for him. And when I finally began trusting Jesus' right living instead of my own that never measured up, I was able to take my subconscious pattern of living and actually turn it into a conscious way of life. What is that? I trust Jesus, I do not trust me. Understand, I trust Jesus and his right living, I do not trust me. I have too much proof, I have too much experience being fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak, and life is going well, and in a split second, becoming a sinner again. I do not trust me. I do trust Jesus, because he made every decision perfect. And so I'm no longer trusting my righteousness. You should not trust your righteousness, but you should trust Jesus, because he has placed his righteousness upon you as his child. Trusting Jesus' right living instead of our own sets us free as his children to enjoy living the way he asked us to live, with a pure heart, instead of leaning on our own work as if it mattered, as if our work mattered in order for God to love us. It doesn't. As if it mattered for God to choose us. It doesn't. As if it matters what we can do for God to save us. It doesn't. This new lease on life, away from performance-based mentality, actually enhances intimacy with God and others. How does that happen? because it alleviates the need for others to act a certain way in order for me to love them. You know what I'm talking about. Even as parents, sometimes we get in the trap. Our love for our kids can be dampened a little bit when they're making bad choices. But when you understand Jesus' right living and you're trusting in his right living as your own, instead of you have to act a certain way and your kids have to act a certain way, you can love them no matter what their choice is. And you want to know what? When we accept people just as they are, with all their issues, with all their shame, with all their problems, with all their sin, isn't that what God did for you and me? That's what trusting Jesus' right living versus your own can do. Now, if you're interested in putting this particular message into practice in your everyday lives, I want you to consider making one of or more of these 4 sacrifices. And to get you started, we'll talk about them briefly. When it comes to pride, how has pride kept you from drawing close to God? How has pride kept you from drawing close to other people? What tentacle, what aspect of pride seems to be your greatest nemesis? How can you bring humility into relational focus? How can you bring humility into your relationships? Now, when it comes to possession obsession, how has your need for more kept you from drawing closer to God? You're always chasing the dollar. You're always chasing the thing. What possession have you depended upon to bring you comfort and peace? That's a pretty powerful question. It might be your phone. It might be your iPad. It might be your car, your house, your boat. It might be another person of what they can do for you. Are these possessions, are these other people, why do they have the biggest hold on your life? Why are you chasing them for rest and peace and comfort instead of praying and trusting God for that? When it comes to positional leadership, how has depending upon your role and that style, how has that impacted your relationship with God and others? I mean, what would be a better way to lead those God has entrusted to your care instead of telling your kids, just do it because I said so, do as I say, not as I do? How can you change that leadership style because God has entrusted you with them to lead them and to guide them to himself? What specific rights, what specific privileges could you sacrifice to increase your influence with others? When it comes to performance-based righteousness, how has that mindset created a barrier between you and God, between you and others? Have you bought into the lie that you and others have to act a certain way in order for God to love you so you can love others? That's one of Satan's lies. What has to happen to completely rely on Jesus and what he did for your salvation rather than what you've done, what you can do, what you will do? You should, in these 4 facets, you should ask yourself, what would happen if? What would happen if? And because of time, we're just going to talk about performance-based righteousness. What would happen if Christians could fully understand, appreciate, and lean on what Jesus finished rather than place our hope on what they're doing, what I can do? What would it be like to truly rely on Jesus' life, to truly rely on his death, to truly rely on his resurrection for our hope, rather than our flimsy-flamsy attempts at living the right way, which we never measure up? Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked me. I got some answers for you. I'll answer those. We'd live right. We live the right way out of love and appreciation for Jesus, not because we have to in order to meet some spiritual standard that doesn't even exist. We'd stop evaluating others and ourselves with momentary measurements. We'd follow Jesus because we get to, because he asked us to, because he's called us to, because he's empowered us to. We'd be able to develop a pure heart and motives that would follow. We'd stop evaluating people based on what they can do for us. We'd recognize that Jesus is more than enough, and what he offers amply supplies and fully satisfies. We'd come to the realization that Jesus isn't the one who needs our sacrifices. Jesus isn't the one who needs our service. We need them. to break free from the selfish shackles that most of us have placed upon ourselves. And moving away from performance-based righteousness would encourage us to walk closer in step with Jesus and closer to others. It would emancipate us. It would free us from our focus on our wants, our wishes, and our ways so that we could focus on His word, His will, and His work. We'd have everything we'd ever need, including intimate living with God and others.